Welcome to the Sci-Fi Rancher story. Here you find the best HYF story written by human. Listen the story. If you like it, subscribe the channel.
My mother won't wake up. The desperate cry shattered the dull hum of the spaceport, cutting through the monotony of boarding announcements and the low murmur of thousands of voices. It was the kind of sound that should have stopped people in their tracks, sent them rushing forward in concern, but no one stopped. Julian Shaw, the former soldier, had been moving through the terminal like everyone else, weaving between beings of all kinds: humans, Larry Hisari traders with their iridescent robes, cyborg mercenaries with glowing ocular implants. The air smelled of oon and engine grease, tinged with the faint spice of street food being sold at the edges of the docking bays. Massive viewing screens flickered with endless streams of departure times and corporate advertisements. But that cry, raw, panicked, hopeless, cut through all of it. Julian turned, scanning the crowd until he found the source. A small girl no older than 8 knelt beside the unconscious body of a woman. She was clutching her mother's hand, shaking her wide violet eyes shimmering with tears. Her small frame trembled with fear, her long golden hair in wild disarray, her deep purple skin glistening with sweat. The woman beside her, tall, elegant, even in her limp state, was sprawled across the cold metal floor, her bioluminescent markings, a trait of the Zeri race, pulsed weakly, fading in and out as if struggling to hold on. She wasn't moving. No one around them reacted. No one even turned their head. Julian swore under his breath the spaceport, like most in the outer colonies, was a place of transit, of indifference. People came and went, minds locked on their own business. A sick alien woman and her crying daughter, not their problem, but it was his. He moved toward them, his steps quick and sure. The girl looked up as he crouched beside them, her terror-streaked face contorted in fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. She won't wake up. She was sick, but she said we just had to get here. She said we'd be safe, but now her small fingers gripped her mother's limp hand tighter. "She won't wake up." Julian pressed 2 fingers to the woman's throat, a pulse faint, unsteady. Her skin burned with fever, yet she shivered like she was freezing. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body unnaturally light in his grip. Malnourished, dehydrated, his jaw tightened. He had seen this before, the signs of someone who had been running for too long, pushing their body past its limits. "She's alive," he told the girl, his voice steady, "but she needs help now." A medical drone hovered nearby, scanning their prone forms. With an indifferent flicker of its sensors, it emitted a programmed response. "Non-priority case detected. Please move to the designated aid station." Julian's eyes darkened. The stations were little more than processing centers, overrun and understaffed. This woman would be dead before she ever got proper treatment. He looked at the girl, saw the way she held her mother's hand like it was the only thing keeping her together. He made his decision, ignoring the drones' bureaucratic nonsense. He scooped the UNC-conscious woman into his arms. She was too light. She felt fragile, like someone who had spent too long surviving instead of living. The girl gasped, clutching at his sleeve. "Wait, were you taking her to someone who will actually help?" Julian said, already moving. "Come on, kid, stay close." The girl didn't hesitate. She ran to his side, her small legs struggling to keep up as he pushed through the indifferent crowd. People stepped aside, not out of concern, but because of the look on Julian's face, hard, determined, the kind of expression that warned people not to get in his way. The medical bay was at the far end of the terminal, past the long rows of docking gates and security checkpoints. The automated doors slid open with a soft hiss as Julian strode in the cold sterility of the place, hitting him immediately. Bright overhead lights cast everything in a clinical white glow. Rows of examination pods line the walls, medical staff moving like clockwork between them. Julian didn't wait for permission. He placed the woman onto the nearest examination bed, her golden hair fanning out across the crisp white sheets. A medical assistant, a wiry man with cybernetic implants across his forehead, approached with a frown. "You can't just, she needs immediate care." Julian interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. The assistant eyes flicked to the woman, noting her weakened state. He sighed and activated the medical scanner. "Fine name." Julian hesitated, then glanced at the girl. She sniffled, wiping at her face. "My name is Lyra," she said softly, and my mother, her name is Saris, the assistant nodded. Inputting the name's relation, Lyra opened her mouth, but no words came out. Julian put a steady hand on her shoulder. She's with me, he said firmly. The assistant gave him a skeptical look, but didn't argue. Instead, he focused on the scanner. The machine emitted a soft hum as it passed over Sarah's body, analyzing vitals, detecting anomalies. A moment later, a red warning flashed across the screen: severe exhaustion, malnutrition, internal stress damage. The assistant read off. He frowned. And something else. There's an unknown pathogen in her system. Not viral, not bacterial, something different. Julian's stomach tightened. Different? How? The assistant shook his head. I don't know, but whatever it is, it's spreading. A soft sound drew Julian's attention. Sarah stirred her fingers, twitched, her breathing hitching slightly. Then, with visible effort, her violet eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she was disoriented, her gaze unfocused. Then her eyes found his. Something passed between them: confusion, weariness, and then something deeper: recognition. No, that wasn't possible. He had never met her before, and yet the way she looked at him, like she was searching for something. Like she had been waiting for something or someone. Her lips parted, barely a whisper escaping Julian. His pulse kicked hard against his ribs. She knew his name before he could ask. How? Her body gave out, her eyes slipping closed once more. The machines beeped urgently as her vitals fluctuated. Julian clenched his fists. Whatever this was, whatever she had gotten herself into, he was in it now. Julian stood with his arms crossed, watching the medical scanner display as it pulsed lines of information across the hovering screen. The steady rhythm of Sarah's vitals. The week remained stable for now. The medical staff worked efficiently around her and administering fluids, adjusting monitors, and exchanging quiet conversations in the clipped, non-nonsense tone of overworked professionals. Lyra sat close by, clutching her mother's discarded cloak in her small hands, her violet eyes locked onto the unconscious woman. Every so often her fingers twisted the fabric, as if reassuring herself that her mother was still here, that this wasn't another nightmare where she woke up alone. Julian wasn't sure why he was still here. He could have walked away after dropping him off, could have told himself he had done enough. But that wasn't how he worked. He'd spent too many years following orders, watching people slip through the cracks, pretending it wasn't his problem, that part of his life was over. The intercom crackled overhead, shattering the sterile quiet of the med bay. Unidentified bounty target detected. Security lockdown initiating. All unauthorized personnel remain in place. Julian's muscles tensed. The overhead lights shifted to a harsh red glow. The distant sound of doors locking in a place sent a cold ripple down his spine. Lyra stiffened beside him. What's happening? Julian's gut already knew the answer before the med staff even had time to react. He grabbed the nearest assistant by the sleeve, his voice low and controlled. What did you log her under? The man blinked, confused. With the name Julie impressed. Did you enter Sarah's real name into the system? The assistant face paled. Why? Standard protocol. Julian swore under his breath that was all that took. One scan, one flag. Identity. And now someone was coming. A deep metallic clunk echoed through the med bay as the security door sealed completely outside the main corridor. The rhythmic clatter of approaching boots sent tension crackling through the air like a storm on the horizon. Julian turned to Lyra. Get behind me. The girl hesitated but did as she was told, clutching the folds of his coat as she hid behind his legs. Sarah stirred in the medical bed, her fingers twitching. But she was still too weak to move. The first shot rang out before Julian had time to react. A piercing blast slammed into the med bay's reinforced doors, sending sparks cascading into the dim red light. A second shot followed, then a third. The metal groaned, cracking under the assault. Whoever they were, they weren't knocking the med staff scattered, some diving behind equipment, others pressing against the farthest wall. In wide-eyed terror, the assistant Julian had spoken to looked like he wanted to protest, but quickly decided against it. Julian reached for his sidearm, his fingers tightening around the grip as the doors gave their final screech of protest and collapsed inward. The bounty hunters stepped through the smoke, their sleek black armor gleaming under the emergency lights. No markings, no insignia. Professionals, their weapons were drawn, their movements precise. The leader, a tall figure with a reflective visor, scanned the room before locking onto Sarah's unconscious form. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice filtered through a voice modulator. Julian didn't move. The hunter took a step forward. "She is a priority target. Hand her over, and one else gets hurt." Julian exhaled slowly. "Yeah, that's not happening." The hunter barely had time to react before Julian fired. His shot hit center mass, sending the man staggering back. The energy shielding on his armor absorbed most of the impact, but it was enough to throw them off balance. Then chaos erupted. The other hunters opened fire, their plasma rounds cutting through the air in sizzling streaks of blue and white. Julian grabbed Lyra and shoved her behind a medical pod before rolling behind another for cover. Sarah's vitals spiked in response to the noise, her body twitching as if trying to wake. But she wasn't there yet. Julian swore as a blast hit the bed's metal frame, barely missing her. He peeked out, counting 3. No, 4 of them, too many to take in a straight fight. Not with Lyra here, and Sarah out cold. The lead hunter recovered, stepping forward again. "Last chance, give us the target." Julian responded with another shot, forcing them back. Then behind him, he heard movement. He turned just in time to see Sarah's eyes snap open, but they weren't the unfocused, fevered eyes of before. They glowed before Julian could react. Saris raised her hand. Energy crackled between her fingers, a deep electric blue that pulsed with raw power. The nearest bounty hunter didn't have time to scream before he was flung backward with enough force to dent the metal wall behind him. Julian didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lyra and pulled her close as Sarah pushed herself upright, her breathing ragged, but her focus razor sharp. The glow along her skin pulls stronger now, no longer weak and flickering. The hunters hesitated. Saris narrowed her eyes. A pulse of raw energy erupted from her palms, blasting them backward in a shockwave that shattered nearby equipment and shorted out half the room's power. That the lead hunter crashed into a console, his armor sparking. His visor flickered before going dark. Silence. Julian exhaled, lowering his weapon. Sarah swayed but remained upright, her eyes still glowing as she turned to face him. "Fully you," she whispered, her voice rough but filled with something unreadable. Julian raised an eyebrow. "You're welcome." Her gaze flickered to Lyra, who still clung to Julian's sleeve, then backed him, and just like before, there was something in her expression that made his pulse quicken, something unspoken, something that the emergency sirens flare to life. "More were coming." Julian sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Great, now we're all wanted." Sarah straightened, rolling her shoulders, despite the exhaustion still clinging to her frame. "Then we should go." Julian smirked. "Now you're talking." Without another word, he grabbed Lark's hand and led the way out, Saris moving beside him. Whatever they had just started, there was no turning back now. The stolen transport rattled as it sped through the colony's outskirts, its failing thrusters groaning with every push Julian gave them. He gritted his teeth, knuckles white on the controls, as the battered vehicle bounced over the cracked terrain. The last remnants of the industrial district loomed in the distance, abandoned factories and rusting pipelines, stretching in of the night like skeletal remains of a forgotten era behind him. Saris and Lyra huddled together in the back seat, their breathing still uneven from the chaos they barely escaped. Lyra clung to her mother's arm, wide violet eyes locked on the rear window as if expecting more pursuers to appear out of the darkness. Saris exhaled sharply. "Are they following?" Julian flicked a switch on the dashboard, scanning for heat signatures. The screen SP buttered with interference. Either the terrain was blocking their signal or their enemies hadn't caught up yet. Either way, they weren't safe. "Not yet," he muttered, "but they will be." Saris turned to Lyra, brushing strands of golden hair from her face. "We're all right, little one, we're all right." Julian glanced at them in the rearview display. The way Sarah held her daughter, her arms wrapped around her like a living shield, hit something deep in his chest. He wasn't sure why, but he forced himself to look away. "We're almost there," he said, adjusting their course. 15 minutes later, he brought the transport to a grinding halt in the shadows of a collapsed refinery. The air smelled of rust and damp stone, the remnants of old mining operations lingering in the wind. He cut the engines and stepped out first, scanning the surroundings. No signs of movement, no aerial patrols for now. They were ghosts. Julian turned back to them. "We walk from Here Saris nodded, though her movements were sluggish. She was still weak. The energy she used back at the med bay had cost her, and he could see the strain and the tightness of her jaw. Lyra, however, hesitated. Is this place safe? Julian crouched to her level, his expression steady. Safer than out there. The girl studied him for a moment, then took his offered hand. Without another word, they moved quickly, weaving through the ruins, until Julian stopped an old half-buried hatch with a firm yank. He pulled it open, revealing a dark tunnel leading beneath. The remains of the refinery, and Sarah climbed down first, lifting Lyra through the opening before following. Julian dropped in after them, pulling the hatch shut above them. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and he switched on a dim light attached to his belt, illuminating a narrow corridor lined with rusted storage attates. Sarah sighed, her shoulders sagging against the nearest wall. This place, you've used it before. Julian smirked faintly. Not the first time I needed to disappear. She gave him a look, but didn't press further. Lyra wandered a few steps ahead, eyeing the old machinery. Is it really safe here? Julia nodded. For now. Saris lowered herself onto a crate, rubbing her temples. We need a plan. Julian sat across from her, resting his arms on his knees. Then start talking, no more half answers. Who the hell were those people? Saris exhaled slowly, as if gathering herself. Then she rolled up the sleeve of her tunic, revealing the glowing lines along her arm. The markings, once thought to be a natural part of her Zeri heritage, pulsed in a controlled rhythm, too precise, too deliberate. Julian's eyes narrowed. That's not just biology, is it? She shook her head. It's a mark, a signature. Julian clenched his jaw. He had seen things like this before, deep black projects, human and alien alike, where people became assets instead of individuals. They experimented on you. It wasn't a question. Sarah slipped away. I wasn't the only one. Julian leaned back against the wall, running a hand down his face. And let me guess, you took something when you left. Saris hesitated, then reached up, pressing a small node behind her ear. A faint shimmer pulsed over her skin. Julian exhaled sharply. Data implant. Everything they did. Names, locations, records, proof. He let that sink in. No wonder they wanted her dead. Lyra, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. Mama didn't want to leave without it. Sarah looked down at her daughter, brushing her fingers lightly over her cheek. I couldn't, not after what they did. Julian rubbed his temples. All right, say we get you out of here, then what? You plan to expose them if I can, and if you can't? Sarah met his gaze, unflinching. Then at least I make sure Lyra never goes back. Julian studied her for a long moment. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the sheer determination in her voice sensed something sharp through him. Lyra shifted uncomfortably. Are you going to leave us? Julian blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Saris, then back at the girl. He crouched down again, leveling his gaze with hers. No, kid, I'm not leaving you. Lyra stared at him for a moment, as if weighing his words. Then, to his surprise, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Julian stiffened. He wasn't used to this contact warmth, but slowly he let himself breathe, resting a steady hand on her back. Sis watched, her expression unreadable, but when Julian met her gaze, something in her eyes softened. A moment passed, then Saris exhaled, leaning back against the wall. You should get some rest, Julian said. Both of you? Sarah nodded, pulling Lyra close. Within moments, the girl was asleep. Julian sat against the opposite wall, his gun within reach, his senses still alert. The quiet felt temporary, a fragile moment in a storm that hadn't yet broken. Sarah's voice came softly. Thank you, Julian. He glanced at she wasn't looking at him, her eyes half lighted with exhaustion, but he heard the weight behind her words. He nodded. Get some sleep. She did, and for the first time in a long time, Julian Shaw realized he wasn't just running. He was in this. All the way. The bunker was quiet, too quiet. Julian sat near the entrance, his back against the cold steel wall, his fingers idly tapping against the grip of his sidearm. His body hummed with restless energy, his instincts refusing to let him relax. He had learned long ago that peace was just a pause between storms. Across the room, Sarah sat on the floor with Laura curled against her side. The girl had finally succumbed to exhaustion, her small body rising and falling with each slow breath. Sarah absent-mindedly ran her fingers through Lyra's golden hair smoothing down strands that didn't need fixing, a mother's instinct something to do with her hands. While her mind remained alert, Julian exhaled, dragging a hand through his own hair. He should have been resting, but the tension coiling in his muscles wouldn't let him. Instead, he stared at the dim ceiling, counting the seconds between each flicker of the old emergency lights. "You don't sleep much, do you?" Sarah's voice was soft, but knowing Julian smirked faintly without looking. At her old habit, she shifted, careful not to disturb Lyra. "Or maybe you just don't know how to stop moving." Julian glanced at her, then raising an eyebrow. "That your professional diagnosis?" Saris tilted her head, her golden hair slipping over one shoulder. "I don't need to be a doctor to see it. You carry yourself like a man who's always ready to run." Julian huffed, shaking his head. "You're not wrong." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt settled, like an unspoken understanding had formed between them. Saris rubbed her arm absent-mindedly, her bioluminescent markings pulsing faintly. "How long was I out?" Julian shrugged. "Long enough for me to start thinking I was talking to myself." A small smile played on her lips. "And what did you tell yourself?" He met her gaze. "That I probably should have left while I had the chance." Something flickered in her expression, not quite hurt, but closed. Julian sighed, rolling his shoulders. "But I didn't." Sarah studied him for a moment before nodding. "No, you didn't." Julian shifted, resting his forearms on his knees. "We need a plan. That relay station you mentioned, how far is it?" "Not far," Sarah said. "A few kilometers from the outskirts. But it's a risk. If they've tracked us this far, they'll expect us to try and reach it." "Yeah, well," Julian smirked, "I'm good at making things difficult for people who want." "He did?" Sarah chuckled, shaking her head. "That I believe." He watched her for a beat longer, then rubbed his hands over his face. "All right, first light, we move." Saris exhaled, leaning her head back against the wall. "Another day, another impossible mission." Julian smirked. "What, getting shot at wasn't enough excitement for you?" She turned her head toward him, her violet eyes catching the low light. "Depends. Are you planning on catching me next time I collapse? Or was that a one-time favor?" Julian paused, his mind flashing back to the fight at the medical bay, the moment he had caught her just before she hit the ground. "Guess you have to find out," he said. Sarah arched a brow, her smirk teasing. "Careful, Shaw. I might start to think you actually cared." Julian scoffed, but before he could fire back, Sarah reached out and lightly traced her fingers over his forearm. It was brief, barely a touch, but it sent a sharp awareness through him. He went, still watching, as she absent-mindedly traced a scar near his wrist. "What's this from?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Julian glanced at the old wound, took a knife to the arm. "A few years back, guy didn't like the way I talked." Sarah smirked. "I can't imagine why." Julian chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, he didn't like the way I fought either." Sarah didn't pull her hand away. Instead, her fingers moved slightly, brushing over his skin, like she was memorizing the shape of him. "You're tense," she murmured. Julian swallowed, unsure if she was referring to his muscles or something deeper. "Yeah, well," he muttered, "not exactly the best place for massage." Sarah smirked, but didn't push. Instead, she let her hand rest there for just a second longer before finally withdrawing. "Try to sleep," she said, her voice softer now. Julian exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "You're bossy." Saris leaned her head back, her eyes slipping closed. "Survivor instinct." Julian watched her for a moment before leaning his head against the wall. His body remained alert, his ears still tuned for danger, but Sarah's warmth lingered against his skin, and for the first time a long time, he thought maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep running. Julian felt it before he heard it, a low vibration in the walls, a shift in the air, the kind of tension that sent a warning straight down his spine. Trouble was coming. He was already on his feet before the scanner on his wrist flashed red. "Perimeter breach. Multiple hostiles moving fast." Sarah stirred, pushing herself upright. She had been resting against a supply crate. Lyra still curled against her side, but one look at Julian's face, and she knew. "They found us." He grabbed his gear. 5 minutes. Maybe less. Lyra rubbed her eyes. "Mama." Sarah's voice was calm, steady. "It's okay, little one. We just have to move now." Julian slung his rifle over his shoulder and crossed the room in 3 strides. The rusted console flickered as he pulled up the bunker security feed. Grainy images popped up, armored figures sweeping through the ruins above them, their movements too precise for common bounty hunters, no insignia, no hesitation. Execution teams, his jaw tightened. They're not taking prisoners. Sarah barely reacted. They never do. The first explosion rocked the bunker. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling. As alarms shrieked to life, the emergency lights flickered, casting the room in flashes of red. Julian grabbed Sarah's arm. No time. We move now. She pulled Lyra to her feet, shielding the girl as they ran. The bunker's corridors shook around them. Metal groaned, distant voices barked orders. Julian led the way, his pulse steady despite the chaos. His mind ran through calculations, routes, escape points, places to bottleneck pursuit. They reached the secondary exit, a narrow shaft leading into the mining tunnels below. Julian ripped open the hatch, motioning for them to go. Sarah climbed through first, lifting Lyra ahead of her. Julian followed last, pulling the hatch shut just as the pounding of boots echoed down the hall behind them. They didn't stop running. The tunnels were tight, rusted beams jutting from the walls, the air thick with damp earth and old metal. Julian moved on instinct, leading them through the maze of abandoned passageways. Then he heard it, the distant whine of a drone scanner. SAR heard it too. They're tracking us, Julian swore under his breath. We need to lose them. A sharp turn brought them to a maintenance door. Julian yanked it open. Ushering them inside it was a storage chamber, small, cluttered with broken mining equipment. Not a true escape, but it would buy them seconds. Sarah pressed Lyra against the wall, shielding her with her body. As Julian peeked through the crack in the door, boots pounded down the corridor. 3 figures swept past, rifles raised, visors glowing. They moved fast, methodical, scanning every crevice. One of them paused, helmet tilting. Julian's grip on his weapon tightened. Then movement beside him. Sarah shifted, pressing against his back as she whispered close to his ear, "There's another way out." The heat of her breath sent a shiver down his spine, but he didn't let it distract him. He nodded, following her lead. She guided them to a ventilation shaft along the far wall. Julian pried the cover loose, motioning for Lyra to go first. Sarah followed, then Jan climbed in after them, pulling the cover back just as the door to the storage room burst open behind them. Narrow escape. Again, the shaft was cramped, forcing them to crawl. The metal was cold beneath Julian's palms, every sound amplified in the enclosed space. He moved carefully, staying close behind Sarah's as they maneuvered through the dark. Then she stopped suddenly, and Julian nearly collided with her. He placed a hand on her back to steady her. "What is it?" She exhaled. "This leads outside." Julian reached past her, prying open the door at the end of the tunnel. A rush of night air filled the shaft. They had emerged at the edge of the industrial ruins, the bunker, now a smoldering wreck. Behind them, freedom for now. Julian climbed out first, scanning the area. No immediate threats. He turned, reaching for Sarah's hand as she helped Lyra out of the vet. Their fingers brushed warm, steady, lingering for just a second, longer than necessary. Then Sarah pulled away, adjusting Lyra's cloak. Where now? Julian motioned toward a derelict landing platform nearby. Resting there was an old transport shuttle, rusted but mostly intact. That Saris arched a brow. "Does it fly?" Julian smirked. "We're about to find out." They sprinted across the open ground behind them. The sound of shouting grew distant, but Julian knew better than to assume they were in the clear. Saris reached the shuttle cockpit first, hands already moving over the controls. "This thing hasn't flown in years." Julian was already securing the hatch. "Then work your magic," Sarah gritted, her teeth pressing her glowing fingertips to the dead control panel. A pulse of energy surged through the system. The ship groaned, lights flickering on one by one. Julian felt the engines rumble beneath him. Then warning sensors blared. He turned, cursing. An enemy gunship was inbound. "Saris, I see it." She slammed the throttle forward. The shuttle lurched, engines straining as they lifted off. Julian barely had time to grab hold of the console as the ground fell away beneath them. A missile streaked toward them. Sarah bankered. The explosion rocked the ship, flames licking at the hull as she fought to stay stabilized. Them. Julian gritted his teeth. "You got this." She shot him a look. "Shut up and shoot something." He didn't argue. Grabbing the manual turret controls, he locked onto the gunship and fired. The blast hit dead center, sending their pursuers spiraling toward the ruins below. Seconds later, they broke atmosphere silence. The chaos faded, replaced by the steady hum of the ship's engines and the vast emptiness of space stretching before them. Julian exhaled. "We made it." Sarah slumped back in the pilot's seat, hands trembling slightly. Liara, still gripping her mother's arm, looked up at Julian with wide eyes. "Are we safe now?" Julian glanced at Saris. She met his gaze, something unreadable in her expression. "For now," he said. Saris turned back to the controls, then lit and not wasted. Julian settled into the co-pilot's seat, watching as they disappeared into the star. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time they had a real chance. The endless stretch of space lay before them, a vast expanse of stars flickering like distant ghosts. For the first time in what felt like forever, no alarms blared, no explosions shook the walls, no footsteps of armed pursuers echoed behind them. They had escaped. Julian sat in the co-pilot's seat, one hand resting loosely on the control panel as he watched the navigation display wave. The ship wasn't in great shape. The hull was scorched from the missiles near hit, and half the screens were flashing error warnings, but it held together. That was enough. Behind him, Sarah sat on the floor of the cramped cabin, cradling Lyra, who had finally fallen into a deep sleep. The girl had fought it for as long as she could, her small hands clinging to her mother's sleeve, as if afraid she'd wake up and find this was all just another bad dream. Saris gently stroked at her daughter's golden hair, her bioluminescent markings glowing faintly in the dim light. The exhaustion was plain in her posture, in the way her shoulders slumped, in the deep breath she took as she closed her eyes for a moment. Julian glanced at her. "You should get some rest." Sarah huffed a quiet laugh. "You keep saying that, but I don't see you sleeping either," he smirked, leaning back in his seat. "Difference is I'm used to it." She looked at him, then studying him in that way she did sometimes, like she could see past his words, past the half-smirks and deflections, straight to the man beneath. "You don't have to keep running," she said softly. Julian stilled. She wasn't talking about the ship. He exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "I've been running so long I don't know what stopping looks like." Saris tilted her head. "Then maybe it's time to figure it out." The space between them felt different now. Charged, unspoken things hovered between them, waiting. Julian shifted suddenly, restless. "What's the plan?" "Then just keep drifting." Sarah sighed, rubbing her arm absently. "There's an outpost 2 systems away. If I can get a signal out, I might be able to reach someone. And if there's no one left listening." She hesitated, then finally, "Then we keep moving." Julian scoffed, shaking his head. "That's not a plan. That's just postponing the inevitable." Saris met his gaze. "You got a better idea?" He didn't. For the longest time Julian had lived by one rule: don't get attached. Attachments got people killed. But now, sitting in the cockpit of a half-broken ship with a woman and her daughter who had somehow slipped past every wall he built, that rule felt flimsy. He let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming against his knee. "You really think there's somewhere safe for you out there?" Saris gave a tired smile. "I have to." Something in her voice made his chest tighten. Liara stirred, then mumbling in her sleep. Saris instinctively pulled her closer, pressing a light kiss to her temple. The sight of it did something strange to Julian, something he didn't want to name. Before he could stop himself, he said, "I meant what I told her." Saris looked upward. Julian held her gaze, I'm not leaving. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her expression. Then, slowly, she pushed herself to her feet and stepped toward him. Julian didn't move as she came closer, close enough that he could see the faint shimmer of exhaustion beneath her violet eyes, the tension still coiled in her frame, the lingering marks of every battle they had barely survived. She reached out, her fingers grazing his forearm. "A small touch, deliberate grounding. You don't owe us anything," she murmured. His hand turned, catching hers before she could pull away. "Maybe I do." Saris inhaled softly, and for a moment neither of them moved. The ship hummed around them, the only sound in the quiet space between them. Then Sarah's fingers curled slightly against his. "A choice, a promise." Julian squeezed her hand once before releasing it. "Get some rest," he said again, quieter. This time, Saris studied him for another second before nodding. "You too." She turned, heading back toward Lyra, settling beside her. Once more Julian watched them for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, staring out at the endless stretch of stars. For the first time in years, he wasn't running toward another fight for the first time. He wasn't running at all. The outpost was nothing more than a lonely cluster of buildings orbiting a dying red star, a forgotten place filled with traders who had nowhere else to go and fugitives hoping no one would come looking. It was the kind of station Julian had spent years passing through without a second thought, but this time it wasn't just another stop. This time it meant something. Julian guided the battered ship into a docking bay, the metal hull groaning in protest. As it settled onto the platform, the engines hissed as they powered down, leaving only the distant hum of the station's life support systems. In a co-pilot seat, Cyrus exhaled slowly. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the armrest, as if bracing for another fight. He reached out, brushing his knuckles lightly against hers. "We made it." She turned to him, her violet eyes searching his for now. Julian smirked. "You got to stop saying that. We keep making it." Sarah let out a small breath of laughter, shaking her head. "I'm just waiting for the universe to remind me that nothing lasts." His smirk faded. He understood that feeling all too well, but for once he wasn't going to let it win. "Come on," he said, standing. "Let's get this done." The outpost interior was dimly lit, the walls lined with flickering neon signs and languages Julian only half understood. The air smelled of engine fuel and recycled oxygen. They kept to the shadows, moving carefully through the winding corridors until they reached the relay terminal. It was an old communications hub, barely operational, but it would do. Cyrus hesitated, fingers hovering over the control panel. "If this works, they'll know where we are." Julian crossed his arms. "That's the point, isn't it?" She swallowed. "If they don't answer, then we find another way," he said firmly. "But we're not running blind anymore." Cyrus met his gaze, and whatever she saw there must have reassured her. She nodded and activated the terminal. The screen flickered, static buzzing through the old speakers. She typed in a sequence of encrypted commands, sending a pulse through one of the few secure channels left. Then they waited. Seconds dragged into minutes. Lyra tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Mama." Cyrus forced a small smile, smoothing Lyra's hair. "It's okay, sweetheart." Julian stayed quiet, his hand resting on his holster out of habit. His told him this could go either way. Then the screen changed. A single reply flashed across the display. "Signal received. Stand by." Cyrus let out a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the console. Julian stepped closer. "They answered." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "It's not over." "No," he agreed, "but it's a start." For the first time in a long time, there was something close to hope in her eyes. They returned the ship in silence. Lyra was already half asleep, nestled in a pile of blankets in the back of the cabin. Cyrus lingered near the viewport, staring out at the distant stars. Julian watched her for a moment before stepping beside her. "You all right?" She let out a soft breath. "I don't know." He reached out, gently tucking a strand of golden hair behind her ear. "That's allow you know." She turned to him then, and for the first time she wasn't guarded. She wasn't hiding behind caution or survival instincts. She was just Cyrus. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted. Julian tilted his head. "You really think I do?" She huffed a quiet laugh. "I guess not." A pause, then softer. "But you're staying?" Julian didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I'm staying." Sarah swallowed, her gaze flickering down to his lips before meeting his eyes again. He felt it before it happened, the shift in the air, the slow lean forward, the way her breath mixed with his, and then finally her lips met his. It was slow, lingering, not a desperate kiss, not a fleeting moment, but something real, something that felt like a promise. Jan's hands found her waist, pulling her closer as she pressed into him, her fingers curling into the fabric of his jacket. He felt the warmth of her, the softness, the unspoken relief in the way she melted against him. When they finally pulled back, she rested her forehead against his, her breath uneven. Julian smirked. "So this may I get to boss you around now?" Cyrus laughed softly, shaking her head. "Not a chance." He chuckled, pressing one more quick kiss to the corner of her lips before pulling her into his arms. She didn't resist. She just let herself sink into the embrace, her head resting against his shoulder. For once there was no urgency, no need to run, just them together. And for the first time in years, Julian Shaw felt like he'd finally found where he belonged.